Good morning. Hi, everyone, and welcome. So thanks for taking time to join us today at the launch of this 2021 Digital News Report from Singapore. So some of you might know me, but some of you may not. I'm Ms. Karen Ho. I'm the Assistant Director at InCube here, and I will also be your MC for today. So before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping rules to ensure a safe a smooth event for all of us. First thing first, please appreciate if you can keep yourself muted during the presentation, so to avoid any unnecessary background noise. And I'm quite sure that all of you will have questions to ask, but please, there will be a Q&A session at the end, so please save your questions till then. Okay, some of you may also be familiar with what InCube is, but for those who don't, the Center for Information Integrity and Internet, InCube for short, is a research center here in Wee Kim Wee School of Comms and Information. So we can have the next slide, please. So launched earlier this year, to be very specific, is 26th of January, where we launched InCube. The goal of the center is actually to aim to provide a timely as well as a relevant research that would help not just the academics and student body, but also to help link policymakers, industry players, and also the general public. So we track information behavior in Singapore, and our research covers a whole broad range of areas, as you can see on your slide as well. It covers really topical, relevant topics of interest that includes media consumption pattern, online falsehood and misinformation, even public opinion on emerging technology, just to name a few. So today, in collaboration with the Oxford University's Reuters Institute, InCube is the first to be releasing our national results for the Digital News Report. Now, this Digital News Report, DNR, as is fondly known, is an annual report that tracks news media usage trends across 46 countries. So it's a pretty extensive research. So to help us kick off this event, let me pass this virtual stage over to our Prof. May Lun, our school chair and also senior advisor for InCube, to say a few words. Prof. May, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Karen. And thanks everyone for joining us today at the Wee Kim Wee School of Communication and Information, Singapore. I'd like to congratulate Professor Edson Tandok and their entire team at our Center for Information Integrity and the Internet, InCube, for the Digital News Report 2021 launch and the cutting edge research work that's being done at the center. The DNR 2021 is an important and very timely global research work that will have implications for much of international media policy and practice. The Singapore survey that we are going to be hearing about today as part of the annual global report by Reuters and Oxford University provides very important insights into the news consumption habits of Singaporeans and their attitudes towards news and mainstream media, and online media, how that's changing, and where news and information updates are critical in Singapore's fight against COVID-19. The survey will also exemplify the type of international collaborative efforts that's being carried out by NTU researchers and scientists in the various fields that aims to address increasingly complex challenges and global uncertainties like the ongoing pandemic. Very importantly for the Wee Kim Wee School, which educates future generations of professionals in communication, journalism, and the media space, the research data will provide very useful information that will enhance our curriculum. It'll help to streamline it with the changing needs of the media landscape of today and the future. So look forward to the talks coming up, and over to you, Karen.
Thanks, Prof. May. And so without further ado, here to share the Singapore research finding is none other than our Director of InCube, Associate Prof. Edson C. Tandok Jr. So Prof. Edson, please.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Prof. May, and thanks everyone who are joining us. And later you'll also hear from Prof. Penghua, who's gonna give some of his comments about the findings. So, like what Karen mentioned, this is coming from the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism's Digital News Report 2021. It's a survey that they've been conducted annually in the last, I think, 5 to 10 years, and this year they did it in 46 countries, and we are the local partner for Singapore. And so, just because we're ahead in terms of time, we'll be the first country to launch the national results. So, for the Singapore survey, the data is collected in January 2021, so that's earlier this year. The sample size was about 2,000 respondents, and the average age is 43.3 years old. So, there's a almost even split in terms of gender. So I'll be sharing about four core themes. We'll start with news consumption patterns, and then we'll talk about trust in the news, where I think some of the more interesting findings are. We'll talk about payment and subscription to news, which is something that the RISJ is also very interested in, and of course, something that affects many countries, including Singapore. I'll also share about false or misleading information, how people's responses and level of concern when it comes to fake news. So I'll now start with the news consumption trends. Going into our next slide here, we're looking at just the sources of news, comparing online, social media, and traditional platforms, particularly print and television. So what we're seeing here is that it's pretty much a very stable trend. We see a slight dip in the use of online platforms for news. Similarly, we see a dip in the use of social media for news from 63% to 57% from last year to this year. There's also a continuous declining trend for print. Not surprising, this is true across most markets, from 29% in 2020 to 27% in 2021, saying they've used this as a source of news in the past week. So that's the phrasing of the question in the survey, whether you've used this particular source in the past week. But there is a slight increase in the use of television for news, from 44% in 2020 to 47% in 2021. So TV remains strong. That is also true across the other markets that they've done the survey in, and this is also partly attributed to a high interest in COVID-19 related news. So traditional media platforms in other countries have also seen a bump in the news consumption during the pandemic. So now we're going to focus specifically on online news. If we go to the next slide here, we're just comparing different online platforms for news, from computer, smartphone, and tablet. This one is also a pretty stable story. In Singapore, since 2017, the smartphone has been the main portal for online news. Still pretty strong at 80% this year. The use of desktop computers, also very much stable at 46%. Tablet, not so much, with only 17% saying they've gotten news from a tablet in the past week. So moving on, we go to the specific brands, and this one I think is most interesting for those who are fans of particular news brands, or those of you who are working for particular news agencies. Let's start first with the one you see on your left side if you're facing your screen. This are the brands that are putting out traditional news. We see that MediaCorp Channel News Asia, CNA, is the most used traditional news outlet. And the question here is also from the past week. So the lighter shade, 39%, refers to those who've used CNA for the past week. The darker shade refers to using it in the last 3 days. So MediaCorp CNA is still the most used traditional news platform, followed by the Straits Times at 38%. This is pretty, again, stable over time. If you now look at the right side of your screen, let's go back to the previous slide. This is now the online news brands. We see that Channel News Asia, CNA's website, is also the most popular news website. 48% said they've used it at least once in the past week. I think what is for me interesting is how Mothership, those of you who read Mothership, it's now the second most popular news website in Singapore at 42%. I've been keeping an eye on Mothership since 2019. In 2019, it clocked in 29%. And it ranked fifth, I think. It moved to fourth place last year, and now it has overtaken Straits Times Online. Although, of course, within, if you factor in the margin of error, they might be at a similar rate. Here we also, being the local partner for Singapore, we also included, I would say non-mainstream news sites, what others would call as alternative news sites, or what others would say as non-legitimate news sites. If you look at the bottom right of the screen, Straits Times Review, 7% said they've used it in the past week. Straits Times Review is actually banned in Singapore. It's operated from Australia. The website is banned in Singapore, but it also has some presence on Facebook. So I think still quite interesting for a website that has been banned to be still attracting at least 7% of the respondents. Moving into the last slide, focusing on social media platforms and messaging apps. Here you will see that WhatsApp is still the most used with social media platform. If you consider it as a closed social media, 88% of the participants say they've used it at least once in the past week. This is followed by Facebook at 70%. This is also pretty stable. There's some slight decline for using Facebook and WhatsApp for news. Excuse me. So I think WhatsApp and Facebook, both of them had a slight dip compared with last year. An interesting trend here is Telegram. We're keeping an eye on Telegram. It has started to rise, not only in terms of usage, but also in terms of usage for news. In 2019, only 7% said they used Telegram to get news. Now it's at 14% at 2021. So I mean, some other insights from the data. 36% say they use Facebook for news because they are there for other reasons, mostly non-news. So this is what some researchers have called as incidental news exposure. So of those who use Facebook for news, 36% say they use it for news because they're already there for non-news reasons. About 15% say that Facebook is a good place to get latest news. 7.9% say that Facebook gives them an alternative perspective when it comes to news. Of those who use Facebook for news, 35% also say they pay attention mostly to mainstream news outlets on Facebook, again showing us that having some presence on Facebook is still important even for mainstream news outlets. 15.8% say they get news on Facebook from the accounts of ordinary people. Sharing of news on social media is quite low. 14% has shared a news story on social media. 22.1% said they've done it via instant messenger such as WhatsApp. Moving on, that's the trend so far when it comes to news consumption. Now we go into trust in news, and globally there's been an increase in the trust in news overall, and that is also true in Singapore. If you look at this slide, this one we're comparing 2020 and 2021. If you look at the rightmost side of your screen, in terms of those who agree that they can trust most news most of the time, it has increased from 36.2% in 2020 to 45.1% in 2021. And again, this is quite consistent with the global average. 45.1% in Singapore is close to the global average of 44%. Finland recorded the highest level of trust at 65%. The United States clocked in the lowest level of trust in news overall at 29%. In Asia, where the digital news report was done in at least 10 countries, Thailand has the highest level of news trust at 50%. South Korea and the Philippines, second to the lowest at 32%. The lowest is in Taiwan at 31%. The same story is true when it comes to news that people consume. So if we go to the next slide, the Reuters Institute also asked about trust in news that I consume. It's also the same story. 50.1% agree that they can trust on the news that they consume most of the time. Also a significant increase from only 41.5% in 2020. Now, this one is where it gets a bit interesting. When we come to trust in social media news, this one has been pretty stable, but it's also very low. We see that 17.8% this year say that they can trust news in social media most of the time. This is what the Reuters Institute calls as a trust gap between overall news trust and trust in news from social media. And the global report, if you read the global report, they also note that the trust gap has increased this year. Again, trust gap referring to the gap between trust in news overall and trust in social media news. The same story when it comes to trust in news that you get from search engines. Again, going to the next slide, this is around 26.5% saying they can trust news in search engines most of the time. This one I think is quite interesting. If you remember in the earlier slides, we still have 40% saying they get news from WhatsApp, 40% saying they get news from Facebook. So I think it's an interesting story how people at least 40% of the respondents saying they get news from these social media messaging app platforms, when a substantial number of the participants also say that they do not trust news from social media. So I think it's an interesting contrast between use and trust. I mean, in journalism schools, I think even in our schools, in some of our classes, we always say that it's trust that drives news consumption, and I think that's an interesting paradox that we're observing here. When it comes to the specific brands, we move to the next slide. This one is again a pretty stable story over the last several years. Brand trust scores have been pretty stable. The traditional news brands have enjoyed the highest levels of trust from the respondents. Again, this another case. This is again another example of what I say is the paradox between consumption, reporting that you use a particular news source, and how much you trust that news source. As what I noted earlier, Mothership has become the second most popular news brand online. But here we see that in terms of trust, I mean, 53% saying they trust the website, but again, that ranks lower than most of, if not all of these traditional news, mainstream and traditional news brands. So that's the story we have when it comes to brand trust. Moving to the next part. And again, if you have questions or comments, please start typing them in the chat, and we can, again, discuss those comments or questions later on. Now we move to payment and subscription to news. As we all know, news is not cheap to put together. I mean, journalists also need salaries to survive, and so it's important to look into revenue, like revenue generation for news. The RISJ has been tracking how many people are willing to pay for news. In Singapore, 14.5% said they've paid for online news content or service. This is below the global average, which is 17% saying they pay for online news. Norway has the highest level of online news payment at 45%. The United Kingdom only has 8% saying they have paid for online news content or service. We see here there are other forms of payment. The 18.7% saying that someone else has paid for their digital news subscription. 10.5% saying they've donated to a digital news service. In terms of the next slide, this is just a breakdown of the payment schemes for news, whether there is an ongoing subscription, whether someone is subscribing to print or digital bundle, or whether people are paying for a single article. There is an option where you can pay for a specific article that you're interested in. That's pretty low at 12.9% in 2021. But again, this is only within those who have a ongoing subscription for online news. Again, going deeper into the data, some 33.7% of the respondents think that news organizations are less profitable compared with 10 years ago. 15.8% say the profitability has stayed the same. 14.4% say that it has become more profitable compared with the last 10 years. One interesting question that RISJ asked across the media markets is whether respondents think the government should step in if news organizations cannot make money. I think this is very relevant to Singapore, especially with the recent restructuring announced by SPH. There is a clear split in Singapore on whether the government should step in if news organizations cannot make money. 32.3% said they don't know. If they're not sure with their opinion. 32.1% said no. So that's 32% saying no, the government should not step in. 35.6% said yes, the government should step in if news organizations cannot make enough money. This is higher than the global average of 27%. Favoring that governments should step in to save news organizations that cannot make money. And finally, moving into the final section of what we think are interesting trends from the Singapore report, we talked about false or misleading information. The next slide will show us the level of concern. So the participants were asked to rate their level of agreement with this statement. Thinking about online news, I am concerned about what is real and what is fake on the internet. This one has been pretty stable. You see that in 2020, 65.8% agreed with this statement. And in 2021, 64.8% agreed with this statement. The difference here is that the 2020 survey was done in January last year, and that's before the pandemic hit Singapore. And so in a way, what we're seeing here is a pretty stable perception of or level of concern when it comes to fake false information on the internet before and during the pandemic. Moving to the next slide, the RISJ is also asking about concern when it comes to different information sources. And this is a trend that's also true across many countries, more so in other countries, whether, thinking specifically about COVID-19 and its effects, which of the following sources, if any, are you most concerned about online? False or misleading information from, 21.9% said they're concerned about misleading information coming from government, politicians, or political parties. 19% say they're concerned about false or misleading information coming from ordinary people. And this is pretty stable, pretty much similar with other countries. For example, countries like Brazil, where the concern over false information coming from politicians is very, very high. And you will see that in the global report, which we'll share in a while. And moving into our, I think this will be is this the final slide? Yes, false or misleading information when it comes to platforms. No surprise here. Most people, 24% of the participants say that they're most concerned about false information coming from messaging apps such as WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger. In Singapore, WhatsApp, this is the highest level of concern comes from false information coming from WhatsApp. In other markets, Facebook is the one that elicits the highest concern in Singapore. It's a second, Facebook at 20.5%. And I think I will end with that. I've given just some of what we think at NCube as the most interesting patterns we're seeing in the Singapore report. If you go to the next slide, I'm showing you a link to the full digital news report. This will include the again, global trends analyzed by the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. If you take what's the term when you try to get the QR code, right? I mean, use your phones, take a look at the QR code, or you can watch the recording later to get the link to the full report, or you can Google Reuters Institute's website. This has been live since 7 a.m. Singapore time. We are, just because we're ahead in terms of time, we're launching the Singapore results now. Over at Oxford University later, they will launch the full global report at 9 a.m. UK time. That will be our 4 p.m. if I'm correct. Also, if you want to learn more about NCube and the research that we do, we also have some summaries and fact books of research that we've done before. Also links to some of our to our launch and also videos of our previous webinars. You can find them on our webpage within the NTU website. You can also capture the QR code on the screen or Google us or find us within the NTU website. Thank you. Back to you, Karen.
Great, thanks, Edson. So some really interesting findings there. But if you're anything like me, I think you probably will be wondering now, like, how do we make sense of all these wonderful data? So to help us unpack some of these data, let me introduce you to another one of our distinguished speaker and also NCube's advisor, Prof. Ang Peng Hua, to share his insights and also analysis of these findings. So Prof. Ang, please.
Okay, hi, good morning everyone. So I'm going to have 10 minutes to go over these comments here. And actually, I think we were hopeful of having a bigger group of people, mainly from the press. So if you see my comments, they kind of address more the lay public, although fortunately I've included some theory inside for the benefit of this group. All right, so let's begin. So I made three observations. First one, it may be obvious to everybody now, but it's the online world for news. Okay, next click. So this is from the IPS study comparing 2015 and 2020, and you can see that where it's circled in red, the online sites have gone up in popularity, right? And the next click, you see that in comparison, print has actually fallen drastically. I mean, you're talking a very serious drop from second highest to number 7. It's even below online websites of foreign mass media. So it's a very serious drop for the print. And my question was whether this kind of carried over to this study or not, because this, there's an artifact. I think this group would appreciate that. There's artifact possibly from the GE general election. Next click. So this is the question. I couldn't locate the slide showing this, but I remember that in the post GE evaluation, Channel News Asia was number 1 and Straits Times was number 5 among brands. I mean, what you saw earlier was among media described by the mode, but Straits Times was number 5. Okay, next click. So here I would say kind of looking the online site on the left side. So I've kind of faded out the one on the right. This kind of the traditional online is what we're looking at. You can see that there apparently was no sort of carryover effect. The Straits Times is number 3 after Mothership, right? So there's no carryover effect, which is, I guess, in a way, you can say it's good for the Straits Times. But on the other hand, it does show that Channel News Asia now is the news media that people turn to on a regular basis. It's both in terms of frequency of use as well as sort of overall. Okay, next click. No carryover effect, and to emphasize that, click again. A bit of drama to show the emphasis. Okay, all right. and then click again. Yeah, so I'm gonna look at this one. Okay, click. Yeah, morphing. This is called morphing, and I spent some time doing this. No, okay, all right. Okay, so to look at this closer, you see that mothership on okay, click please. Yeah. On at least 3 days per week was less frequent in Straits Times. This is quite, quite heartening for traditional media, because it means that there is still room, I guess you could say, for Straits Times especially. It's not like all gone, right? You could argue that it's within the sampling error, but I think it's fairly robust. I think that's the mean, fairly robust finding. Yeah. Okay, next click. In sort of continuing that line about online news, so in the 2020 study, Carol Soon found that the high IM is mainly WhatsApp used by boomers. Being a boomer, I'm not surprised. I mean, why are you surprised, right? So okay, so it's okay, boomer, we are not surprised, right? So why higher use of information seeking? Okay, so like some speculation, it's probably easy now to use online now, 5 years later, 2015, right? So you can think of the features that come on, I think that's the first thing I would say. The second one is FOMO, right? People are now online, so you will connect the peers, right? So I have, in the last 5 years, I had a lot of alumni groups. I have one group from my secondary 1 days. Then it's a very active group, and we meet regularly, right? For food and drinks, all right? So we meet, and so I see a lot of these online alumni groups are forming, and I hear a lot of these groups happening there. And then, of course, connecting with children and grandchildren. So I think that the online space will become even more important, and I think the study on the social media use is quite critical going forward. Okay, next click. Okay, so this is again the point about the online websites, right, and how important they are. You can see that the social networking sites IM is pretty high up, right? Okay, next click. Okay, so my next observation is that in this space we are generally in a high trust environment. Yeah. Okay, next click. So you can see that there's quite high overall trust. I know Ethan had mentioned that it is in line with sort of global trends, but global trends we could argue that Norway is an outlier at about 40%, right? So it's kind of an outlier there. In fact, I found it out quite recently. In Norway, because they have a strong reading culture, I guess in Norway, an MRT train they will be reading. In Singapore, MRT train, our people will be sleeping. Yeah, so there's a slight difference in our approach to how we spend our spare time when we can, right? Okay, so next slide. Yeah, so to compare that, so it's kind of interesting. All right, yeah, click. You can see that when comparing overall trust in news and news that I consume, right? Okay, click. Yeah, you can see that there is an optimistic bias, right? The news that I consume, right? I mean, I am the guy is good. My news I consume, of course, is trustworthy, but it's you I should worry about. Yay, I don't know you. So this raises the question in relation to what had been asked about social media, whether the question could have been phrased like social media use in general and social media news that I consume. I would expect a similar, this is called a third person effect, a similar third person effect that, the news that I consume is more trustworthy than news that my neighbor consumes. I expect that. But the question is how high that kind of factor, yeah? So it'll be worth looking at maybe for the next round. Okay, next click. Okay, my final observation is that there's still a high level of concern over false or misleading information, right? Quite high. Okay, you can see that it's not really moved that much, right? So in movement, and the movement here I would say is movement to neutral. So people are not saying they disagree that this is a question, right? Thinking about online news, I'm concerned about what is real and what is fake, right? So the question is, how concerned are you, right? And people are concerned, right? So they're moving, in fact, to neutral. They're not moving to disagree. I think it's kind of a surprise. I mean, I would find it a bit surprising why this would be the case. So I'm suggesting, as your hypothesis here, that perhaps POFMA didn't really, in a sense, lower the temperature there. That POFMA may, in fact, heighten some concerns, because the argument would be that POFMA has reduced misleading information, online misleading information, right? So therefore, you should have a higher, a higher level of disagreement, right? We're less concerned, right? But they're moving to neutral, right? Not moving to disagree. The second one is that I think conflicting information from the pandemic, right? If you can think in the US, of course, well, actually Singapore also, mask, no mask, right? So if you recall, the initial days was, mask or no mask. So some conflicting information, and even from the authority. So perhaps, and I guess you folks here would appreciate this point, perhaps this may have led to people feeling that they should still be concerned about conflicting, about missing information, conflicting information online, in the online space. Okay, my final slide. Yeah. So this is a slide that kind of got me quite excited, because the question is thinking about specifically about COVID. Which are the following sources? Okay, and it goes on talking about might be misleading. So the first one, I was a bit surprised, talking about Singapore case, politicians and political parties, right? Okay, next click. But this is very much in line with what is happening globally as well. So the concern about COVID misinformation, the number one source that people are worried about would be the government, politicians, or political parties. Okay, in Singapore's case, we have lumped them all together, right? Government, politicians, political parties, and so it's kind of hard to tease out. So maybe this should be teased out, because in Singapore, certainly, I think political parties were served a POFMA for wrong information, right? So to what extent that led to this perception that, okay, these people may be giving false information, right? So there's a concern there. But I think it's kind of what I would argue may be a right call, right message, or right opinion, in the sense that if you look at incentives, yes, that group would be sort of incentivized, right? The rest, I mean, it's hard to see where the incentives would come from, in misinformation. The incentive being, of course, your political base. So the rest of it is pretty similar across. I just want to point out that journalists or news organizations rank low with us, and I would say this is consistent with our view of news environment being trustworthy. Yeah. Okay. So on a note, I'm going to end this series of comments here. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Prof. Ang. So we will now open up for Q&A, now that we have all got a chance to listen to the very insightful observation by Prof. Ang, and also Prof. Edson's sharing on the findings and the data. So if you have any questions, please unmute yourself and introduce yourself. If you choose to ask your questions via the chat function, that's fine too. So we look forward to hearing from you.
Yep, and while people are, phrasing their questions, or mustering the courage to on their video, I also would like to acknowledge our research fellow for InCube, Dr. Tang Hao Go. If you can turn your camera on, he's done some of the data analyses for our presentation today, and he's also done some analyses for other trends that we've not shared. So if you have questions, we also answer based on the data for Singapore. Yeah. Yeah. So any questions or okay? I think Karen, yeah, we have a question.
Sorry, so we do have a question from so regarding news consumption preferences, what are the possible reasons behind Mothership's rise in popularity? So Prof. Edson, do you want to take that one?
Yes, and I'll Tang Hao, Dr. Go actually did some analyses comparing demographics and the use of traditional and online brands. Tang Hao, do you want to take a stab at this question?
Actually, we did some analysis, and then we actually found that actually in terms of age-wise, right, we found that most younger population, younger group of audience, they tend to choose online sources of news. So actually that actually include alternative websites. News websites like Mothership. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, if I remember the analyses, even especially for mothership, right, age was a negative predictor, meaning the younger people tend to report more frequent use of mothership. So it's really the younger demographic that is going to these kinds of websites. In contrast, I think we found positive correlations between age and traditional news brands. So you remember the slide we have on the leftmost side, when you're facing the screen, we have all the traditional news platforms. Yeah, age was positively correlated with the top three traditional news brands. So definitely age, I think, yeah, like what Tang Hao said, age plays a role here.
Yeah, I think just to add to what Prof. Edson was saying, I think one of the interesting things that we find from this research is that even though mothership is quite high in popularity, it doesn't necessarily translate in terms of high in terms of trust level, right? And if we look at the type of stories that mothership covers from the more traditional media, you would see that mothership tend to cover more of the softer news as well, a lot more entertainment type of story. And I think that's the kind of news that appeal to the younger generation, because when you're on social media, you want to read not just for the hard news, but you also want to kind of unwind, relax, and find out what's going on in my neighborhood. So I think that also accounts for the popularity of mothership, because of the nature, the type of stories that they cover as well.
Yep. Prof. Peng, did you want to add your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I agree with Karen. The news on mothership, and what also put out there, right? That on a daily basis, the traditional media is more referenced, more read. Mothership, I was looking at the kind of carryover effect from the GE, because in GE people will be looking for all kinds of news, and so some of them could be literally trying out mothership for the first time. I can imagine that. And then because news consumption is a habitual thing, the question is whether in that period of time, people develop kind of a habit or signing on, so they got the mothership more frequently. I suspect there's some of that, but not enough to sort of tilt and make it in a major way. Mothership's news operations is helmed by one of our alum, distinguished alum, Jeanette Tan, and what I gathered from her is financially, at least, it is still in the red. So if you're talking about it as ongoing concern, it is a concern, right? The question is whether it can actually sustain in the long run or not. Yeah.
I have a question. Thanks so much, Edson, for sharing, and thank you, Peng Hua. I will. Can you see me or hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My question pertains to the influence of the entire pandemic and all the different restrictions and policies that have impacted the entire globe, in terms of how because you've seen shifts more in the different types of media space usage. And I'm wondering how much is influenced by what happened in the past 18 months. So in other words, if I could, phrase my question the other way, it's, if not for the pandemic, would you have seen some of the trends in, as large capacity as the shifts have been? How much do you think the changes in the audience behaviors have been led by the pandemic? For instance, television, right? Because if you are locked down, I would think that there would be greater propensity to turn to the television, for instance. So I'm just wondering, like, these wide level effects.
Yeah, thanks, Prof. May. I think that definitely that's one of the main explanation during COVID, when people are spending more time at home, that they will have more time to attend. First, I think attend to news per se. I think before COVID, the global trend is also true in Singapore, based on studies we've been doing at the Wikimwi School, that the appetite for news has really gone down. especially for a younger demographic. But that appetite for news in general, I think, has increased because of first, people are when people are uncertain, they try to get more information, and one of the main places to get information about what's happening around them is news platforms. And second, being confined to our homes most of the time during circuit breaker, and even after, when we're encouraged to work from home as our default, I think we have more time to spend with these more traditional platforms, and that also explains the bump in the use of television for news. Actually, I expected that the bump will go more into social media platforms, because even when our home, we're still glued to our phones or maybe our desktop computer. So I was expecting that the bump will actually go into social media. But even in other markets, the bump actually went into television. And even I think in the US and the UK, at the peak of the pandemic, they were seeing a record high audience sizes for television news. In Singapore, television news as a source of news has been pretty stable, but we saw the slight increase during COVID. And I think that definitely a big part of the explanation there is us being able to spend more time with the traditional platform, since we're confined in our homes. In the global report, those of you who will read it later or have read it, they also noted that the print, again, I mean, I worked for a print newspaper before, so it breaks my heart. But definitely with us being confined at home, with all the restrictions and physical delivery of newspapers, street sales have gone down. So the trend of print going down further is true in most markets. Yeah.
Yeah, I think on this point, I was looking at the artifacts from at the time of data collection. In fact, that was my very first question, right? When was the data collected? If you look at 2020, if it was collected in January, that would have been a time of your so-called insurrection in the US. And in fact, I looked at remember the last slide showing 29% globally, the concern about politicians being the source of COVID misinformation. In the 2020 report, it was 40%, 40. So actually, it's a drop to 29% globally. And I was going to say, well, Singapore is half of the global, right? And I think there was that artifact there at that point in time last year. This year, I don't really see it. I think the COVID led people to look for more authoritative sources. So I would say your traditional media, there's sort of a rise, and in fact, there were some reports about kind of a reversal, so that the traditional media was kind of having some kind of recovery. And I think people would appreciate the need for this kind of authoritative information, because it's literally life or death. So I think that makes a huge difference. People can see the value of having news information there. Yeah, reliable news information.
Yeah. So just to add to that as well, I think what is also interesting is that if you think of the usage of the different media platform, whether it's traditional media or the online, I think one of the things is that we need to think of it as not being mutually exclusive. It's not like if people go online means they don't go traditional media or vice versa. And I think in a time like this, as what Prof. Ang said earlier, people want authoritative source. So sometimes you see certain news coverage, whether via your social media or people are sharing it with you, but you want to verify it. So that's when you go to the traditional sources, because you know that these are more authoritative and more reputable media. And so, that probably explains the rise in the television news as well, because those are usually the more traditional and reputable sources that we know, and we use it for, to verify some of the facts that we read from the alternative platforms. Yep. So are there any other questions? So far, thank you so much. I think pretty interesting. It wasn't like a Q&A, it's more like a discussion. So anybody else, any other questions, feel free to just unmute yourself and ask, or you can use the chat function as well.
And while some of you might be phrasing your question, we'll get Tang Hao to share the screen again to show you the link, the QR codes For the full report, it's again, you can download it. You can read it from the RISJ website, as well as download the fact books that we've produced for InCube. There it is. Yeah. So, any questions or suggestions? I think one thing that we will feed back to the Reuters Institute, like what Prof. Pengwa said earlier, is also drilling into the social media news trust, right, between the social media news that I consume versus social media news use in general. I think definitely the bias there, what we see in overall news versus news I consume might also be true with social media news use. I think, Karen, you have a question?
Yes, we do. So thanks, Pei, for the question. So I'm reading the full report and it says trusted brand do better online. So SPH comes to mind, and yet they are falling in ranking. So the full report also indicates that there is mistrust when media is not perceived as fair. So do you think that there is the coffin in the nail for SPH? Are there data that indicates how Singaporeans feel about media fairness among local media players?
Yeah. I'll answer this first, and then I'll turn it over to Prof. Pengwa. I think it's important to notice that the percentage of people who participants who say they read Straits Times online weekly or in the last 3 days, it has been pretty stable over the years. So it's not as if the readership base is shrinking. The interesting thing is Mothership's audience base has been increasing steadily. And it seems that the audience base for these two platforms, there's a very small overlap. So I think what Mothership is attracting are people who may not read traditional news anyway. And now I think because they are drawn to some of the content from Mothership, they're also reading some news that Mothership gets to report. So I think the ranking, I think it's correct. The ranking has been changing in the last few years, but for Straits Times specifically, the audience base has remained pretty stable. If there's a decrease, it's very, very slight. For me, and I will now turn over to Prof. Pengwa. For me, what's interesting as someone who's been studying the Singapore media in the last seven years, and again, my perspective is coming from someone who's moved here only 7 years ago. All these. I mean, there's a consistent high level of trust in the traditional news media in Singapore, but that trust comes with very keen awareness that traditional media is closely identified with the government. So in other countries, this is considered the audience has considered this as contradictory, that it's either or. Either they trust the media or they perceive the media as biased toward the government. But in Singapore, in the research that we're doing, these are not mutually exclusive. For me, that is very interesting. But Prof. Pengwa.
Yeah, so I mean, Edson, you're absolutely right. So I won't look at it from that point of view. I mean, it's the question of issue of perspective here. If you look at SPH, right, it is not an online medium, no. I mean, if you think something so basic, right, as popular most read articles, they don't have it. If you look at even journals, you have the most cited, most read, most downloaded. They have all this info. Academic journals, right? We are the boring ones, right? People look for us, right? You have this most cited, like for what? Who cares the most cited or not, right? It's not relevant, but they put it out there. The Straits Times has nothing like that. Look at it. Channel News Asia has that. Most popular articles, right? Something very basic. And this is your FOMO, right? If other people are reading it, I should be reading it also. You are using something that's really sort of common now, but in the online space, they don't have it. So I would say that in SPH, there's room to grow. You need several nails for a coffin. A few have gone in, but not all of them have gone in. There's still some hope, yeah.
Okay. Thanks, profs. So if there are no further questions, then we will end the session here. The full report, as mentioned earlier, the QR code is still online. So please, click it, download from the link so you can have a look at the full report. We hope that you have found this session useful, and we definitely look forward to seeing you again at our next InCube event. So have a great day, everyone, and thanks to our speakers. Have a great day, everyone. Stay healthy and stay safe.